You're listening to Lucid Cafe. I'm your host, Wendy Halley. Welcome to another episode of Lucid Cafe. In today's episode, I speak with author Radhule Weininger about her new book, Heart Medicine: How to Stop Painful Patterns and Find Peace and Freedom at Last. Radhule is a clinical psychologist and teacher of Buddhist meditation and Buddhist psychology. She's the co-founder and guiding teacher of the nonprofit Mindful Heart Programs, which offers a safe refuge for meditation and education programs in mindfulness, meditation, and nature connection in the Santa Barbara area. In our conversation, Radhule shares how mindfulness techniques can help you break through the painful patterns that hold you back so that you can begin to live with more freedom, confidence, and peace. So please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Radhule Weininger. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. So you have a new book called Heart Medicine: How to Stop Painful Patterns and Find Peace and Freedom at Last.
Mm-hmm.
I like that. There's a dash and then at last. And you got the Dalai Lama to write a foreword, as well as Joanna Macy.
Yeah,
you're rubbing elbows with some pretty amazing people, huh?
I lucked out there. Well, a very good friend of ours, my husband's and mine, and I don't know if she's more of a friend or a mentor. She's both, So, and the Dalai Lama, I took my teenage kids to India every year since 2010. And then I would go to his talks every year, and I guess he always encouraged me, in our tiny little audiences, to bring his practices, his spirituality into the world.
And look at you. That's exactly what you're doing. So his encouragement sounds like it really paid off, huh? It worked?
It worked. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, you also are a clinical psychologist and a meditation teacher. So how did all of those things that you do come together to create this book, Heart Medicine?
Yeah, I don't know how significant it is, but when I'm from Germany originally, and I started out as a medical doctor. So far too much school.
That's a lot of school, yes.
I have to say, in my defense, I always ran away to India to study.
That was your escape?
Even during medical school. So, So I was rather the unconventional student. But how did it all come together? I think first it came probably out of my attempt to save myself. I suffered deeply from medical school and from the pressures of my family, and having been the illegitimate kid in a Catholic family, and I had 2 big car accidents in my early 20s. So I really felt that I was in an orphanage the first 2 years of my life.
Right. You shared that in your book, and what a beginning to your life.
Yes. And so I had to either sink or swim, or let's say sink or fly. Luckily, I had some wings. I found my wings.
And did you find them later in life, do you think? Or were you able to find some wings earlier in your childhood?
That's so interesting. This is a bit far out, but that's okay, I guess, no? So
I'm all about the far out.
All right. So I told you a little bit before that my other love besides meditation is dream work. And yesterday I had a session with my dream guru, Robbie Bosnack, who does embodied imagination, and where you embody the images in a dream. And there were an image for depression, heartbreak. There was an image for heaviness and stuckness. And then there was an image which first was a ghost, but as we embodied the ghost, it was a little cloud, a white or translucent, a lucid little cloud. And as I went into that with Robbie's help and really explored that, I realized that cloud was there when I was in the orphanage.
Really?
And maybe long before, who knows? I don't know how it all hangs together. And so
How do you see that cloud?
kind of,
Or how do you interpret it?
how do I interpret it? It's probably something I actually describe when I think about it in my book, Heart Medicine, the mystery that is already there.
It's embodying in your dreaming as a cloud.
Yeah, exactly. I guess that's the idea. And the thing is, if you really embody it, then you can draw on it. Then your body remembers it. And it's an experience I feel when I do, especially my Tibetan influenced meditations, where you rest in the field of awake awareness. And yes, you could use that as an escape, but it could also be just one, let's say, if you imagine an alchemical vessel in which are different pieces, different aspects. They are in this vessel of attention and loving attention, let's say, or therapeutic container, however you want to call it, psychospiritual container. And then in this vessel, yes, you have the depression, you have the heaviness, the world, suffering of the world, but you also have the cloud. And you don't split off with one of them, but you integrate them. And then we can be with our sadness and with the suffering of the world, but there is a wider perspective.
So would you say that kind of captures the essence of your message, what you just described?
Well, maybe yes. I hadn't meant it to be, but as,
I just thought I'd ask. It doesn't have to be, but the way you described it, it does kind of capture
yeah,
what you were imparting
yeah,
in your book,
yeah. And
just said in a different way.
yeah, and it doesn't mean we don't have to do the heavy work, the leaning into our grief and working with our trauma and our relationships. But there's also a wider perspective that we can rest in as well.
Yeah, it's super helpful to be able to pull out and see the bigger picture, I imagine, right?
Mm-hmm.
To give you that perspective, so that you don't feel like you're drowning maybe so much in the pain.
And I'm always maybe being a post-war German and kind of with this mission never again. I'm very interested in the world, and it's very concerning. It's like, yes, it's as a friend of Joanna Macy's, it's not on a great trajectory with climate change and everything that's going on. But how can we be present to this without getting overwhelmed, without shutting down? And so that's actually my next book. It will be on how can we use these practices of resting in a wider perspective to be activists, to be engaged.
All right. Well, maybe you'll have to come back on when that
I
book
love
is
to.
released, and we can continue this part of the conversation. But we'll get back to your current book.
Yeah,
So tell me about LURPS.
good. Long-standing, recurrent, painful patterns. And, I came up with this in a discussion with my mentor, Jack Cornfield, for the last 20 about years. And we talked a lot about my LURPS, my long-standing wounds. And he encouraged me to write about it. And, Jung and Freud called them complexes, these knots of emotions, thoughts, feelings, sensations, events that kind of repeat themselves, not exactly, but in different clothes with different actors, in different sceneries. And they're sometimes shapeshifters, they come up where you don't expect them. But then Jack said, find a new word. And so I came up with my long-standing recurrent painful patterns, and he said, oh, that's too long. I started teaching about it, and I came up with LURPs, because it's like, do you call it, onomatopoeia, where something feels the way it sounds. And then my students or clients started to say, oh, I got LURPed, or there was this LURP again, or it's feeling a bit like slime.
Yeah, that definitely, it does have that slimy kind of feel to
Yeah.
it.
And then LURP leads to a loop. So that's how that came about. It's like, and then he encouraged me to make something useful out of all my exploration, and which I did.
So it sounds like you've been able to incorporate your background as a psychotherapist, as a psychologist, into this practice by looking at these patterns and how they relate to trauma.
And how they relate to trauma. I think the second chapter is at the core of a LURP is trauma. And yes, I do think at the core of one of those knots in the psyche is trauma. There is pain, there is sometimes violence, sometimes neglect, sometimes it's very blatant, sometimes it's what we call micro traumas of coldness or neglect or being put down or excluded or whatever it is.
Like over a period of time and they just kind of collect.
They collect or they reappear. Sometimes they go underground a little bit and then they come up again.
I was going to say, how nice of them.
Well, you see them mainly, we see them as a drag, it's like, oh, couldn't they just not be there? But then one thing I try to say in my book is that they can also be a portal. It's like if I hadn't been in this orphanage, if I hadn't had these relatives that sometimes were less than nice, if I hadn't had these car accidents, I wouldn't have hit, so to speak, rock bottom or the windshield and gone to Sri Lanka and ended up in that monastery.
Yeah, it is interesting when you look back on
Mm.
your life, right, and see how actually everything seems to be beautifully orchestrated in kind of a messed up way.
Yeah,
Like
like that.
all of the things that happen to us,
Mhm.
the devastating things, the wonderful things, they all seem to put us on a trajectory of sorts that gives us opportunities to heal and be better, it seems. But it's like if you look back in hindsight, there's a clear kind of path. Like, well, if this hadn't happened, then I wouldn't have ended up here,
Mm,
or I wouldn't have ended up learning from this person or
mhm.
studying with this teacher or whatever.
Exactly.
I like the way you're reframing these difficult experiences, these challenges in our life, to look at them more as opportunities. They're opportunities to grow and to heal. I mean, I've thought about this. If life was easy all the time and you're not bumping up against any friction or any challenges, you would be stagnant, don't you think? You just wouldn't
Mm.
go anywhere.
Yeah, that's why I think the Tibetans talk about the precious human life. We are between the gods and the hell realms. I don't know. Let's take them as metaphors, but there is some movement possible. And yes, a lot of it is pre set, but there is a little bit of wiggle room. And I don't know how to hold this, because if you look at so many very unfortunate people who might be stuck at the border in cages or refugees somewhere traipsing through middle America or
Yeah, that's tough. It's tough to kind of look through
yeah,
that lens I just described
yeah.
when you're going through devastating challenges like that. Yeah.
And some people just seem to get broken
Mm.
by them. So I don't know how. But then we learned from even from concentration camps like Viktor Frankl or
Yep.
Anne Frank, or we know that even there, some came out of it having learned something.
Right. I guess it's hard to understand why any of us ends up in the place that we do.
Yeah.
We're faced with the trauma that, I mean, we can speculate, but we don't really know why
Mm-mm.
in a lot of instances. But maybe for each one of us, it is presenting an opportunity around your perspective, right? Of how you're going, like
Mm.
Viktor Frankl is a great example of being
Right.
in a concentration camp and then coming up with an entire kind of philosophy
Mm-hmm.
based on that experience, what he was observing around him. So this idea that, I guess, what would you say, it would get back to our thoughts or our beliefs, and can we become a prisoner of our own beliefs?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Our own assumptions and preconceived notions, limiting beliefs, and whatever, habitual feelings. And I think there's a lot of mystery there that we don't understand yet.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm.
Would you say that all trauma can turn into a LERP?
Well, I don't know. Um, but
Okay.
honestly speaking, maybe there are some traumas. I think it's important how the response to the trauma is. It's very interesting. In gosh, this is now 1989 or so. I gave and I wrote my dissertation about it, incest survivor groups in a big hospital in San Francisco. And because I knew how to lead groups, I basically gave all these groups. Somebody had left, there I was. And we interviewed these women before they came into the group about what happened to them. And so the very clear impression I got, and my colleagues, is that it depended on how the parents responded. Like if, for example, something really terrible happened, but the parents responded very loving and appropriately and believed and helped. And I remember there was a woman who had been, as a young girl, abused by I guess, somebody in the forest. And it ended up really badly. But the parents were really on top. You know, they really took her to the doctor. She was 2 weeks in bed. They were loving. And so she still had probably a little bit of a body image problem from that, but she was actually quite well.
Wow.
So, and even though it was a very violent thing that happened, the conclusion we came up with, it's how the environment responds to the trauma.
So if the person who experienced the trauma doesn't get that kind of support,
Mhm.
then it's much more detrimental.
Yeah. And sometimes that non support, like being told to not talk about it, don't tell anybody, or this didn't happen, you just,
Being dismissed, yeah.
yeah, that often is even more traumatic than the original trauma.
I could see that.
Yeah. Yeah. So there are many different causes and conditions.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that you touch on in your book is, my understanding of it is sort of ancestral
Yeah.
trauma and how that can even impact someone. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think is it just in the last 10, 15 years, I don't know when it was first talked about, that actually there's a little change in the methylation on our genes that gets altered by trauma that goes through the family. And I think we don't know really how it all hangs together. Again, we have like tiny bit of science, but there's probably a lot more. But I think, and we noticed that working with these women who had been abused, how there was often 3, 4 generations before that something similar, terrible boundary violation.
So like a generational lerp.
Hmm. Yeah, or, it's like maybe the lerp of being an outsider, or whether it's being a refugee or somehow outcast for some reason.
Mm.
That can often happen in families.
I call them ancestral beliefs too. They're so subtle. They're such a part of the fabric of our upbringing that we don't even realize that they're there until maybe later on and we notice a pattern. Maybe we believe that nothing good ever lasts. Like we got that message,
Yeah,
and that message just has been carried on from generation to generation, or that there's never enough.
yeah, yeah.
It's a little bit different than what you're talking about.
It's very similar. But one thing I might want to ask, because if you just talk about beliefs, then it comes back, oh, it's all in your head. So the idea is if you can just change this belief, the schema, which I know many do believe, and I think the jury is out, then we can just change this. Just find out what your faulty belief is, change it, and you'll be all fine. And I think that's maybe a little bit the contribution from the East when they talk about samskaras instead of complexes or lerps. These are seeds in our mind stream that are carried along through lifetimes. And they are not only beliefs and thoughts and feelings, but they're also events. See that it's all just in our head, and this is the border, and outside and inside are very, different, is also kind of a Western belief.
About beliefs.
Yeah, it's a Western belief. I just remember looking again at these many, many women we over the years interviewed at St. Mary's Hospital in San Francisco. Yes, it is probably beliefs, but it's also sometimes uncanny how things happen to people again.
So you're saying that we shouldn't say that the belief is what's creating
It
the
might be
event.
one thing. It definitely is. It's very important, the belief.
Yeah, I always thought they were in response to the event. Like we might create a belief and it typically becomes deeply unconscious
Yeah.
in response to a traumatic event or what we're observing about the world or ourselves, that we create these beliefs, and that they're not necessarily accurate, but they
Yeah.
can kind of color our experience of ourselves and our
They do.
reality.
But it's then there is sometimes the idea that, oh, if I just change this belief, then I'm in control again.
There is that, yes.
And I think there was, I think Howard Cutler, who interviewed the Dalai Lama, and he said, "Do you believe in nature or nurture?" And the Dalai Lama said, "If everything was just nature or nurture, that's like we lost a key and we decide it has to be under the street light because that's the only place where it's light and we can see."
Hmm.
So there might be other possibilities.
So what do you think? How does one start becoming aware or changing these LERP experiences?
Mhm. Well, we can only change what we can change. So I think starting with ourselves is a good thing.
Makes sense? Yeah.
We can't influence who comes down the street. We can maybe choose the street, but there are things we cannot influence. So I think it's a good thing that to work on ourselves and what we can influence. But it's just important to keep it a little open and to say, well, it's actually maybe more mysterious than we think it is. Otherwise, we can put a little bit of trip on ourselves. Oh, I must still not having all my beliefs under control.
Right. We Westerners are very head centric and we want to understand and make sense of things,
And
right?
have it nicely packaged. So
Mm-hmm.
I maybe am a bit of an iconoclast and I like to just kind of rattle a little bit.
Well, rattle away. Yes.
rattle away. But I think looking at the 12 steps that I propose, definitely, we do what we can do. It's like recognizing the learn. It's like, oh yeah, it feels like a tightness in my chest, and maybe I feel like somebody punched me in the stomach, and I suddenly feel the energies leaving my body, and or I feel super frustrated, maybe more frustrated than I think I should be, and to notice, oh yeah, I've gotten lurked there, and then to use those mindfulness skills, of being mindful, noticing with moment by moment, non judgmental awareness, what is going on, and notice our thoughts and feelings as they arise and pass through. And those mindfulness skills are invaluable. And then coming to self compassion, it's like holding ourselves with a sense of gentleness and warmth, and not pity, but just kind of like Martin Buber said, an I thou between us and ourselves, and a sense of compassion in general, like for our human condition. We were kind of wired in strange ways, as we see again and again. Just turn on the news. It's like, there it is. And then to learn to bring mindfulness not just on the cushion, but during the day in little mindful pauses.
So, for someone who has no mindfulness experience, what do you recommend is a good way to start the idea of becoming mindful?
Mhm. Well, there's now a real amazing array of classes, online classes. We have a online platform, mindfulheartprograms.org. Maybe you can put that there somewhere. It's free, and people can just hop on and off. It's like every morning at 7:30 to 8 is just a half hour. And with the guided meditation, it's like a sing along, it's a meditate along. You kind of pick it up. You don't have to read a thick book before you ever start. And I see many people starting like that. Actually, I started like that. I didn't know anything about Buddhism or meditation before I fell into this place in Sri Lanka. And so I think we can learn slowly, and then we get more interested, and we can take a class, or some people just hop in and hop off a guided meditation class. And slowly we kind of get the gist of it, that everything is changed, that we can pay attention, and what we pay attention to becomes reality. So, and we can notice when we got stuck in rumination, and we focus back on the body. And it's actually quite simple. Man, it's simple but not easy.
Yeah, that's a good differentiation. Yes.
Yes, so it's not that complicated, but you have to remember. I know one of my teachers, Alan Wallace, translates mindfulness with remembering. Remember when your mind went off into circular thinking, to come back to the exhale, to your body. It's like to bring it gently and kindly back. And then it gets easier and easier. It's like going to the gym. At first, it's terrible. It's like, going to the gym and pushing these weights or whatever. And then after 2 weeks of that, you say, when can I go to the gym? It feels so good in my body. I feel so much
So you start
better.
craving it.
You start craving it. And so it's just like that.
Well, you make it sound very inviting.
Well, try it out.
What would you say are some of the benefits of having a mindfulness practice?
I think we are creating an inner refuge, because so often we feel like sitting ducks in our outside circumstances. How our partner is, if our kids are behaving, if our mother is old and we take care of her, what that's like, our boss, the weather, you know, and it's all there. I don't at all deny that many people have incredibly hard lives. Actually, that's why I created the meditation platform, the free one. And actually, I have only a free one. So, but then it's good to know there is a place like the little white cloud that we can actually find. And then we can be there with a different attitude, with a different perspective.
If I'm to understand correctly, what you're talking about is the difference between having an external focus and an internal focus, of not being as caught up in the external events that are happening, but turning your focus inward so that you can find that place of refuge.
Mm-hmm. Yes, even though the distinction internal and external is a little bit academic,
Okay.
because internal isn't just physically inside. You know, it is first because you come back to what does my body feel like? Oh yeah, there's a tightness, and I can actually feel the sensations in my body all at once. And when I get distracted, I can come back to that. And I notice, so there is a sense of freedom in that. But actually, that awareness isn't just inside, it is actually everywhere. But first, we have to look inward.
Okay. So are there better words to use than internal and external?
Maybe getting away from literalizing.
Oh,
I
black
don't
and
know.
white, you mean?
Yeah, and
I was just trying to think of a way to say it so that people could understand.
let's stay with internal, external. But it's just important to know that
It's not black and white,
it's not black and white. And as you go on with meditation, you actually notice that awareness is everywhere.
that it becomes more gray. It's actually gray, and that's the reality. Is that what you're saying?
Or, you know, it's like water. Awareness is like water. And sometimes the water is muddy. And sometimes there are little things in the water, like stones or leaves or whatever. But at the essence, there is water.
Okay, that works. That makes sense.
Mhm. And our thoughts and feelings are like waves on this water, waves on the ocean. They arise and then they, you know, when we realize they are not literalized, they are not things, you know, it's like waves on the water that come and that go back into the water. And there's some freedom in knowing that the water is there, even in the muddiest water.
That is just part of the water's state at that time. Or you could translate it as your state at that time, but it's not a permanent state. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, and it's not its ultimate essence.
Gotcha. All right. So, one of the things I want to get back to that you mentioned is the idea of becoming aware of these patterns that exist in
Mhm.
ourselves, and the challenge of becoming aware of something that you're not aware of.
That's a tough one. Yeah. And I think first we need to get some pointers. Like, I remember when I first went to therapy, I remember still in Germany, 19, whatever, 79 or 80. I remember my first therapist asked me, "What do you feel?" And I said, "I think this and this and this."
Hmm.
And I just took me months to figure out that there was actually a physical and an emotional feeling besides my thoughts. So it was quite a long road. And so I think it helps to be pointed to that by a good therapist, by a meditation teacher, by, let's say, the teacher could even be online, you know. So, and to notice, oh, yeah, actually, I can feel my body and I can feel my heart contracting. So to feel like, let's say somebody is sending me an email, you're disinvited to our birthday party or something, you know,
That would be sad.
yeah, or you're not part of our group anymore. To feel that pain, feeling maybe the heart contracting, maybe a little dizzy or nauseous, maybe feeling cold. And then maybe in the past, we would have gone right to anger. Pick up the phone, or now it's text message, and text a barrage of,
I'll tell them, yeah.
I tell them, they're idiots. And then sure enough, everything is much worse, right?
Yeah.
And so to take a little mindful pause and to feel, oh, wow, this feels really tough. And my heart contracts. I feel a little nauseous, dizzy, maybe my jaw gets all tight, whatever it is.
Right.
Then to feel, oh yeah, I'm mad, I'm disappointed, but under that, I also feel really sad. That probably takes a little bit more work on oneself to realize that under that rage is also maybe fear or sadness, maybe the sadness of the little girl that happened to a lot. And then to stay with that for a little while and then take a bit of a mindful pause before responding rather than just reacting.
Yeah, buying yourself some time seems like a really good idea. I think in any instance, especially when you've been triggered.
And often suffering is translated as reactivity.
That makes sense. Yeah. One of the things I want to point out that I think is a really wonderful point that you brought up is the idea of paying attention to your body.
Yeah,
Your body is brilliant at kind of getting your attention when things are amiss. So if you're not used to being mindful and paying attention to your interior experiences, to use that word, then your body will, if you start paying attention to your symptomologies, what you're saying, then that's a lot of great information.
it is. And I feel I learned that both from psychotherapy, years of Gestalt therapy and body oriented therapy was really helpful, especially starting out so heady. I had to go into the body. But then also in meditation, with the meditations I teach, I always start with the body, really feeling the felt sense, the physical sensations of the body right now, and then going from there.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense, especially since, like I was saying a few minutes ago about how we Westerners are so top heavy, we're so in our heads that we can get disconnected from our bodies. And then also the side effect for many people who have trauma is dissociation. So they're not in their bodies. And so they don't really have a relationship with their bodies. So that's really foreign territory. I think that's a gentle way, though, to get reintroduced to your body, to start paying attention
Yeah.
to the little messages it's trying to give us.
Yeah, I could say when I look back being a child or a teenager, I probably was in this dissociation stage a lot.
No, it would make sense. It sounds like you had a really difficult introduction to the world.
Yeah, and I think sometimes dissociation can be protective.
Absolutely.
If you're this woman who's getting, or this child that's getting abused, could be a boy or a girl, it's a saving grace that the body is dissociating.
It's a great coping skill, really, to get you through a really challenging experience. I think the difficulty lies in when you stay there, when it's not difficult. You stay in that dissociated state.
Yeah, and so then slowly come back. And then when you, in addition to coming back, also learn to rest in the wider perspective of awake awareness, then it's easier to let go of that coping skill of dissociation.
You mentioned going into compassion, that seems like it's the ultimate goal, is to move into compassion for yourself and for
Mhm.
others in the world. It sounds like a beautiful thing to do, but I don't know how easy it is. What do you think?
Well, I think if we had quite a bit of trauma and hurt, we can either really shut down or we can feel actually quite compassionate towards others. There's the wounded healer archetype Chiron and Asclepius, who both were wounded, and that gave them the motivation, the incentive to help others with what they learned in their own healing journey. So I think sometimes it can lead to compassion, and also understanding oneself and others leads to compassion. And also compassion allows us to not feel so isolated and so us versus them. The Dalai Lama always says that as we understand all our interdependence, we realize that we are kin, that we cannot exclude anybody. I just know from my own childhood, I always brought home animals and orphaned dogs and cats and whatever, friends. So I think quite often from trauma comes great compassion.
Well, that's good to hear.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine the capacity for deep compassion is there when you've experienced a lack of compassion.
Mm-hmm. And then when we learn to meditate, part of this field of awareness, or whatever we want to call it, I think different religious or mystical traditions call it different things, whether it's Christ consciousness, or it's Allah, or it is the field of awareness, or it is Chi, or whatever it might be. An aspect of that is love. So as you kind of relax and connect into that, that's something that is there underneath it all.
Which is good news, right?
Yes. So, they call Mahakaruna and Karuna, small compassion and great compassion. Small compassion is very personal from our frontal cortex. Oh, I should be nice to so and so, to the children in Africa or whatever,
Okay.
which is very worthwhile, but that can get burned out, like many caretakers know. But if we connect to that a priori or already their place of awareness and compassion, that actually cannot burn out.
So it's about tapping into that.
Tapping into that. And, actually, when was it? 2 weeks ago, my husband is a hospice palliative care doctor at the local hospital, and caregivers burn out right and left now with COVID. And so he was asked to give a grand rounds on this. People know that he's interested in this. And so we both together gave a very, you might say, esoteric, but also practical grand rounds. And there were a lot of doctors and nurses and chaplains and social workers, and people loved it.
I bet they did. It was probably just the medicine they needed.
So actually, if anybody's interested, we have the recording from the hospital. So I think it's not as esoteric as we think.
No, it sounds like it's the goal, ultimately, for
Yeah.
all of us.
And it's quite teachable.
Also good news.
Yeah, it's easier than we think to teach. I think sometimes religious groups, and they make it very complicated. You have to have a card membership, and you have to follow huge rule books and this and that.
Maybe
and
wear a certain outfit, or
wear a certain outfit. And
I'm being a smartass.
well, and I'm not against it. If people like to do it that way, that's great. But that's not the only way. There's a much simpler way.
Well, I like the idea that it's accessible, that it's not just for someone who's willing to jump through certain hoops or whatever, that it's accessible to anyone who's willing to take a dive into the water,
Yeah, and that realizing that the water is always there.
that they were already in it.
That's right.
Huh. Well, what is the best way for people to find you and your work and these meditations that you offer?
Well, my book, Heart Medicine, And on my website, radhuleweininger.phd.com. The practices in that book are also recorded. So with the printed practices, there's an audio recording, and I'm still, discussing with Shambhala Publications to make an audiobook. They're in discussions with Audible or whoever it is. So hopefully there will be an audiobook. Then we have our meditation platform, mindfulheartprograms.org. It's a nonprofit. And we sometimes give courses. Sometimes I give courses. Then there are the free daily meditations, really in the mornings at 7:30 to 8, 10 to 11. Somebody has a self-compassion class they're giving midday on Mondays, then in the evenings, usually at 7. And then there's a grief groups on Saturdays. So there are different offerings there, some by me and some by other teachers. And so, please join us. I have a day job as a psychologist, so I can afford doing this platform for free. I was just asked by Omega Institute, which is in upstate New York, to give a course. And so that will be from the 18th to the 20th of July. And it will be on these long-standing recurrent painful patterns. They wrote to me and they want me to give a course. So that's maybe not that far from where you are.
No, it's not very far. It's about a 5-hour drive.
Yeah.
But yeah, so people even far away can travel to Omega to take your course if they'd like to.
I think that's it. And if you really have a question, it's radhule@gmail.com.
Okay, I will include the links in the show notes so people can easily access them. And I just want to thank you very much for coming on and chatting with me.
That was really great. Wonderful. Thank you so much for being such an amazing interviewer.
Oh, wow. Thank you. Well, what I learned from speaking with Radhule is that I'm pretty mindful of my lack of mindfulness. So that's good. If you'd like to learn more about Radhule's new book, Heart Medicine, or explore her free meditation website, mindfulheartprograms.org, please check out the links in the show notes. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll be back in a few weeks with another thought-provoking episode. Until next time.